Hello, everybody, and welcome to my post-reflection final presentation on inclusion in education. So a little bit about my topic, why I chose it, and the aspects of inclusion. My topic is about the importance of providing additional support to students with disabilities, specifically in a higher education and college setting. I mean, like trade schools, community colleges, that's where this is mainly coming from. I chose this hopefully to gain more insight about what it's like going to college and having a disability and why those resources that are offered are detrimental to a student's success. Um, and so the aspects of inclusion I'm hoping to focus on are education and social services, but these go in hand long term with employment and community engagement, obviously, because a lot of jobs you need a college degree. You can't get a college degree if you don't get accommodations, and it's just, this whole continuous cycle and pattern. So yeah, to talk a little bit about my interview. I interviewed Miles. He is my cousin. He is an 18-year-old freshman at Southwestern Community College here in San Diego. Um, I chose to ask a student instead of any staff because I do work at a community college myself, um, to see what his perspective was and how resources are affecting him at his college. So I asked him a little bit about what resources he was receiving, and he was able to connect with someone from DSBS. He gets accommodations for homework extensions, quiz extensions, things like that. I chose to ask a student because I feel like the best way to understand a student's experience is to ask a student with a disability and get their firsthand experience. Miles is fortunate enough to go to a community college, in his opinion, that is very, very nicely set up for those with disabilities. And I also want to be a professor and I work on a community college campus. So these are just important things for me to know, especially where the DSBS is located, because I do interact with students on a daily basis. My background knowledge on this was that most schools do have an organized DSBS office, which is for students with disabilities to request accommodations, have it on record, get help with schoolwork. I know the one on my campus has a few aides in there to help students with disabilities with their homework, as well as counselors. And I believe they have a few social workers as well to do like some case management. Um, but yeah, here are a few of the course materials that I chose. I chose race, identity, stereotyping, and voluntary oppression. Um, I chose this because it focused on stereotypes and biases, and I feel like before being able to move forward with inclusion, we have to be able to recognize our own biases. And I also use this article to gain knowledge about the damage and perceived notions of those with disabilities. An example of this also is my interviewee. During our interview, he told me that he had faced a lot of specifically teachers in like high school and middle school who doubted him due to his learning disability. But again, that's not the case. He's doing fine, great, having good grades, joined some clubs. And then also I chose equity, parental caregiver power, and disability policy in the US context. I chose this because of the history. I had some great background about the um, Individuals with Disabilities Equality Act. Um, and it gives about some current context in our education system of what it's like getting those resources. It also goes pretty heavily into intersectionality, which plays a role in prejudice against disabilities and feeds into stereotypes. And I wanted to highlight those in my interview. So, like, we talked a little bit about that and how this concept kind of relates. The I'll talk from my experience. The community college I work at is predominantly students of color. So there is a lot of intersectionality there, and it's important to acknowledge that and look at the person as a whole and not just one facet of their life. And then this is my outside research. I chose the articles Higher Education and Psychiatric Disabilities National Survey of Campus Disability Services. I chose this because when we think disabilities, Usually people who are able-bodied like I am, we think physical disabilities, we don't think psychiatric disabilities. And I felt like this article really shed light of that as well. That psychiatric disabilities, they are a thing, they affect learning, and they need accommodations as well. And then I also chose Access Constraints Experienced by Physical Disabled Students at South African Higher Education Institution. Um, this article was able to give you a good visual representation. It had loads of photos of the daily struggle those with disabilities have to worry about. And like it's literally as little as thinking about which way you should go to get to class so you don't have to run into any things that you can't get up, you can't cross over, et cetera, et cetera. Um, this article like specifically highlights students not being able to get into buildings where their classes are because there's no ramps. But yeah, I thought that was like a good visual to just kind of put in perspective what that's actually like. So here's a little bit of evidence. This is from the article Higher Education and Psychiatric Disabilities National Survey of Campus Disability Services. This table shows the amount of like the percentage of students with psychiatric disabilities. We can see the range over here, our mean, our standard deviation, our mode, and our median. Yeah, but this is just talking about students with psychiatric disabilities receiving services. I specifically chose this over physical disabilities because I feel as though psychiatric disabilities are not talked about as much and are overshadowed, brushed off, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I decided to include this just so you could see that there are also resources for that, but they're not as used as physical. So a little bit of overview. We're going to cover inclusion, equity, and access real quick. Um, so this is kind of the piece of evidence I chose for equity. It was from the same article as previously about psychiatric disabilities. This talks about all of the common issues that are faced with people with psychiatric disabilities. For example, right over here, you can see the issue, number of people, and the percent. Down here, just like to note that 265 schools participated. I learned about the intensity of psychiatric disorders and how can they affect a student's ability to succeed. They aren't given proper accommodations. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really think much of psychiatric disorders, let alone calling them disabilities or even thinking about that. So I feel like this article really opened my eyes to like the more broad terms. And I chose this for equity specifically. Because it just paints a clear picture about the differences between psychiatric and physical disorders. And I feel like it's essential to note that accommodations aren't a one size fits all. You kind of need to get what works for you. And so that's why I chose equity, because when um, talking about accommodations, you need what's for you, and you don't need the same thing as someone who's in the wheelchair if you have a psychiatric disability. So getting told where the ramps are for a psychiatric disability is not going to be very helpful to you. All right, we're going to be moving on to inclusion. I included this little sample letter to request a reasonable modification. Um, I learned a lot about the IDEA in this course specifically. I didn't realize how recent of an act that really is. It's like a year older than my dad. Um, but yeah, I learned about how a lot of public education establishments must make reasonable accommodations. And I chose this for inclusion because this is not something that gets talked about, not even, it's something that able-bodied students don't even have to consider. And I feel like before we can normalize things and move forward with inclusion, we need to educate ourselves and we need to talk about this. We need to normalize these kinds of conversations. So I chose this to display what it is like before starting a class. Students having to go out of their way and prepare and email their professors. So yeah. And then accessibility. In the first module, I believe there's this one video that sticks with me till this day about how our built world is not built for those with disabilities. And this is from the article Reasoning about Accessibility for Disabled Using Building Graph Models on BIM and IFC. This photo right here shows an office layout, and it shows an accessible office layout. Like if you can just see all like the offices over here, and you see how there are hallways coming out to each office, and then a hall here to get to these offices and all of these rooms. But I chose this as an example for accessibility because it's just a good visual about how you can make your workspace accessible. Also, there was some other content that was read in this course that talked about how even those with disabilities, those with physical disabilities who are unable to get up from their desk office area as often, they may even feel ostracized because they are robbed of the normalcy of being able to just walk around and casually have a chat by the water cooler. Just kind of those little things that we don't even think about. This kind of provides the option, this layout provides the option for that to become a possibility. So this is something that I want to know going forward. I want to know how I can be a better ally and more conscientious. I think the most important part is educating myself, and specifically for my field of work, I think I need to go to the DSPS office and learn as much as I can, gather resources for student, and ask detailed and thoughtful questions. I should also be inquiring about any upcoming staff workshops or events I can come show my support at, and maybe even ask over there what are some good ways I can be a good ally. And then a question for my peers that kind of goes hand in hand with that. What is one way you show intentional allyship? Yeah, but thank you guys so much. These are my resources. I'm gonna hang here for a couple more seconds so you could see them and check them out. But yeah, thank y'all so much.